Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for your coming. So we are very close to the end of the semester. So we are going to enter a new module, right? So let me just quickly review what we have learned. Okay, so we have started three modules. In the first module, essentially, is a review of micro, right? So this is in the first module. And then in the second module, what we learn is the basic macroeconomics. And there we focus on measurement. Okay, so we learn how to measure in the macroeconomy in terms of GDP, price level, labor market. Now in the third module, so which is the module we just finished, and we had an exam on Monday. Okay, and I believe everybody did a good job. So in that module, we studied aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So in that module, so we understand what determines GDP, both in short run and in long run, and what causes the economic fluctuation, particularly in the short run, right? And we also understand, so the market is going to self-correct itself in the short run. But from the discussion there, we realize, so this correction process can be lengthy and it can be painful to the economy. And typically, so it's going to cause high unemployment or it's going to cause high inflation. So that calls for government intervention. So that is going to be the main topic of the last module. So in the last module, we are going to look at two chapters. Okay? So we are going to look at fiscal versus monetary policy. Both are considered government policy, but they have different instruments or they have different tools. Okay? And they have their pros and the cons, or the benefit and the cost. Right? So that is going to be the main things in the last module. Right. So now let's look at what we are going to study in this chapter. Right. So in this chapter, so we will study what is fiscal policy and understand why it is important to use that tools to managing economic fluctuation. Right. And then so we are going to look at different type of fiscal policy, typically including expansionary versus contractionary. Okay, so they are designed to dealing with different economic fluctuation. And then next we are going to look at multiplier effect. Okay, so this is the third time we look at multiplier. But you're going to see, so this multiplier effect has a lot to do with earlier multiplier we have learned earlier. But here, so this multiplier effect is going to tell us the government policy will have important impact in terms of managing economic fluctuation. But depending on which policy we use, so the net impact will be different. So that's going to be the main things there. Okay, and after that, so we're going to look at public debt and implicit liability. Right. So just a quick heads up, what is implicit liability? Essentially is what the government promised to the population and particularly for the future population. So that is also considered as a debt or burden to the government. Okay, so that's important to consider when we think about fiscal policy, right? So that is the roadmap of this chapter. So we have a video to watch. So I would prefer to wait towards the end of today's class. So essentially, this is the second half. In the first half of this video, so they talk about what is the cause of the economic fluctuation, right? And then, so in this half, the second half of this video, so these two gentlemen, so they argued about how the government can do or should do. Now, so just remind you, so these two gentlemen, one is called Keynes, the other is Hayek. Right? So they have right here. So they have very different view regarding to the cause of our economic fluctuation, and also in terms of how the government can respond, or should the government respond, right? So let's just wait for a little bit late. So now let's just look at fiscal policy. So what is fiscal policy? To understand what is fiscal policy, I would prefer to start with this picture. So this picture shows us 4 different countries. They're considered high-income countries, right? So these 4 countries, we look at 2013. So look at 2 numbers. One is government spending. The other is government tax revenue. Okay? So what is government tax revenue? So essentially, it's the total tax the government can collect from the economy. So this tax includes income tax, corporate tax, consumption tax, property tax, and so on and so forth, right? So this is a tax revenue. And then what is spending? So the spending we talked about earlier, right? So we talk about the transfer. Okay? So what is considered transfer? Think about Social Security. Think about Medicare and Medicaid. Think about food stamp, right? Or think about child care credit. So those are transfers. And another type of actual spending. Think about government pay for renovate highway system. Government pay for national defense. Okay? Government pay for their employees. So those are spending. Right? So look at these 4 countries. Overall, the average government spending is close to 40%. I should look at here. So this is in terms of GDP. Meaning every year, so about 40% of what the economy produced will be used by the government. Okay, so that's pretty large. Okay? Now, if we look at tax revenue, so the tax revenue varies from country to country. Okay, but overall, it's more than 30%. Another interesting thing I want to point out is, in general, tax revenue is less than government spending. But that immediately means government across the board. So this government is running a deficit. So think about individual. This is essentially, so this individual is running a credit card debt, meaning so the individuals spend more than they earn. So here, so the government, so income coming from tax revenue. Look at the United States, 31% of total income, total GDP. But they spend 38%. Okay? So they spend more than they earn. Okay? But the other important message coming out of this picture is that so the government plays a central role in modern economy. Just look at the size of government spending. Okay? So that's why we need to look at fiscal policy, because this is something we cannot ignore, right? Because this is a big chunk of our economy. Right? So the government collect tax, they are going to use the tax revenue to do a few important things. Right? So it includes government transfer. Right? So these are payments by government to households for which no goods or service is provided in return. Okay? So important example is social insurance program. Right? So the social insurance program is government programs that are intended to protect families against economic hardship. Okay? So there are 3 examples. Social Security. So this is for economic hardship during old age. Okay? Because when we get old, and then so we lose the ability to work, lose ability to make money. Social Security also protect people who get disabled, right? Either due to work or due to accident, right? So this is Social Security. Medicare, this is protect family against healthcare costs, okay? And old age as well, right? Now the last one, Medicaid. Medicaid is also for healthcare, but this is healthcare for low income, okay? Or for women, children, so who have hard time to cover their healthcare, right? So you can see those are designed to protect families against different type of economic hardship. Okay. Here is a breakdown of the source of tax revenue in the United States. Okay. So the largest income source for the government coming from personal income tax. Just think about the tax return or tax, the tax you filed at the beginning of each year. Now, so we pay income tax there. And the second biggest single item is social insurance tax. So if you ever pay attention to your W-2, so you should realize if you have a job, so you pay two tax. One is payroll tax. The other is Medicare tax. So the payroll tax is collected to finance Social Security. Okay, so you pay payroll tax roughly 10% during your working age, and then so when you retired, and then so you are eligible to collect Social Security benefit. So for example, if I'm retired today, okay, and then I probably collect $2,000 per month, right? And so the reason why I can collect $2,000 per month, if I, but by the way, so here just condition I'm old enough and qualified for Social Security, which in the current law is around 65 years old. Right? And the reason why I can collect this Social Security benefit when I turn into 65 is because I paid payroll tax, 10% every year. Right? And the other is Medicare tax. So this Medicare tax is around 5.9%. It's split between employer and employee. So this Medicare tax is paid, and so that we can finance our Medicare. So this Medicare is going to cover our old age health insurance, or also it's going to cover just in case the workers or the family get an accident, disabled, right? And then so we have other type of tax. Think about the consumption tax. Okay, so if you go to a grocery store, or if you buy electronics, okay, and so we are going to pay tax. And even if you buy a car, so you're going to pay tax, consumption tax. Also think about property tax. Okay, and maybe some tax on certain goods. Think about tobacco. Think about alcohol, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's other taxes. And then so we have corporate profit tax. Essentially, if there's a business, and this business makes some profit in a given year, and then so the business needs to file tax for their profit. Okay? So this is a breakdown of tax revenue in the United States. And this is how the government spend their money, right? So look at certain important terms, Medicare and Medicaid. So this is against healthcare costs, right? And Social Security for old age, and the national defense, that's a big expanding. And then education, right? So this includes K to 12, because all the public schools are free or close to free, right? And then they also pay or sponsor, so like state university, right? And what else? Right, so other government transfer. Just say, for example, earlier this year, pandemic hits, and the government has a stimulus plan and send every American citizen a check. Right? So that is considered as other government transfer. Now, here we have a term called interest payment. And what is interest payment? So as we saw earlier, in 2013, US government, so they collect 31% of total GDP. I mean, the total tax revenue they collect is 31% of total GDP. But the government spending is 38%. There's a shortfall. And then, so this shortfall must financed by borrowing. But the borrowing comes with some cost, right? And what is the cost? So the interest. Because essentially, government borrow in the market, and then they must pay interest for the money they borrow, right? So this is how the money, how the government spend their money. Yeah. Now let's look at this practice question quickly. Government programs that are designed to protect individuals or families from economic hardship are described as a fiscal policy. Yes, it is a fiscal policy, but it's not precise. Right? And B, discretionary fiscal policy. So as we are going to see later, so this is not discretionary. This is an automatic stabilizer. Okay? C, monetary policy. This is not a chapter about monetary policy. D is social insurance, right? So D is correct. Okay? So these are practice questions. Now, we need to review this equation so that we understand why we need government and why we need fiscal policy to help the economy when the economy is in trouble, right? So this equation comes from earlier chapter when we look at measurement of GDP. So GDP equal to C plus I plus G plus X. So the last two term is net export, right? And so first, in the previous chapter, we learned, so sometimes there's a shock to the economy, shocks to the economy, right? And so we have two types of shock. One is a supply shock. The other is a demand shock. But examine the economics and examine the data, and then we realize most of the trouble of our economy was caused by demand shock. Right? So now we can examine this equation a little bit more careful. So GDP, or the total demand, equal to C plus I plus G plus net export. Okay, just imagine if we have a negative demand shock. Okay, so if we can somehow offset this negative demand shock, and then so we can deal with this economic fluctuation efficiently. But how we can do that, right? So in the previous chapter, we learned, so the market will self-correct itself, right? But that process can be lengthy and can be painful. Now here, so by examining this equation, and then we can see the government can affect the demand through direct approach, which is G, and indirect approach, which is C and I. So they can directly control G, essentially because the government, they have the ability to change government spending. So if the government spending change, significant increase, and then the total expenditure will increase immediately. So this is how government can directly control G and directly affect aggregate expenditure. The government can also indirectly affect other aspects of the economy. Okay, so they can affect C and I. Why? Just think about if government cut tax, and then so households will have more disposable income. Business will have higher net tax return. So that is going to encourage people to spend and encourage the business to carry out investment. Okay, so both will increase the aggregate expenditure. Okay, so this is how government can affect the economy. This is in the case of negative demand shock. And it should be obvious or should be similar if there's a positive demand shock. If we want to change the economy, or if we want to minimize the shock to the economy, and then the government can do the opposite. Okay, so now we introduce fiscal policy, or the definition of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is defined as the use of taxes, government transfers, or government purchases of goods and services to shift the aggregate demand curve. Right? So the point here, end point here, is to affect aggregate demand. But the fiscal policy will affect aggregate demand through use of taxes, transfer, or purchase of goods and service. Okay? And a different administration, they prefer different type of fiscal policy, as we are going to see later. So they are going to have different implications on our economy. Like President Bush, so he preferred tax cut. That is the same for President Trump. Okay? And then President Obama, he would prefer transfer or maybe changes in government purchase of goods and service. All right. Now we can look at the first characterization of fiscal policy. Right? So we are going to differentiate fiscal policy by contractionary and expansionary. Okay. So first look at expansionary fiscal policy. So expansionary fiscal policy is a fiscal policy. This fiscal policy is designed to increase aggregate demand. Okay, increase. But how a government policy and particular fiscal policy can increase aggregate demand? So they're going to carry out through the following three approaches. First, increase in government purchase of goods and service. Just think about the government decide to spend money to build a new highway system, or the government decide to spend money in the development of new vaccine. So this is increase in government purchase of goods and service. And the second approach can be a cut in tax. Okay, as I just explained a few minutes ago. So this cut in tax will increase households' disposable income, will increase business net tax return. Okay, so that is going to increase their incentive to consume and invest. And lastly, maybe there's an increase in government transfer, like what happened in earlier this year. Okay, so this increase in government transfer will increase households' disposable income. So that's going to encourage spending, right? So that is going to, so those are called expansionary because that's going to increase aggregate demand. Okay? So in some sense, we can think expansionary fiscal policy as extra fuels for the economy, right? So these extra fuels is going to speed up the economy. So this is expansionary. Okay. So now we can look at how expansionary fiscal policy can close a recessionary gap. Right? So where we are at E1. And E1 is probably caused by a negative demand shock. Right? So originally we are here. So because of a negative demand shock, so the demand decrease shift to left-hand side. We are at here, so E1. So at E1, so you can see, so our output is below potential output. right? And then so we have a recessionary gap. And right now, so the unemployment rate is very high. Okay, and then so what the government can do? So the government can increase the government can lift up this demand curve by carrying out expansionary fiscal policy, as we just saw, as we just discussed, right? And then so immediately we are going to move back from E1 to E2. Okay? So by the way, just remind you, so this is so from E1 to E2 immediately, this is through government's expansionary fiscal policy. Now, if we leave the economy alone, okay, and so yes, the economy is going to adjust, but this adjustment is going to be different, right? So the adjustment will be, so yes, you have unemployment, and then so eventually the wage rate will drop, and then the aggregate supply will increase. So that's where we are. Right after, so if we leave the economy alone, right? So yes, eventually we return to the potential output level. We return long-run equilibrium, but you can see the price level has been depressed. Okay, so that's going to cause other trouble to the economy. All right, and plus this adjustment process can be lengthy. All right, so this is expansionary fiscal policy. Now we can look at other side of the story, contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, so this fiscal policy also want to change aggregate demand, but instead of increasing aggregate demand, so this fiscal policy is designed to decrease aggregate demand. And then, so how the government can achieve that goal? So they are going to do the things exactly opposite to what we just learned in expansionary fiscal policy. Right? So the point of this contractionary fiscal policy is when the economy goes slow. And why the economy want to go slow is because typically, so when we have, maybe just go to the next slide and then come back to this. Okay? So when we have a positive demand shock, so probably most likely it's like here. So this is the original one. And then, so this is a positive demand shock. The economy moved to the right-hand side, and we in a new equilibrium. In this new equilibrium, there's an inflationary gap. Okay, so this inflation is going to hurt the economy. Right? So we have talked about the cause or the damage of inflation in early chapter. Right? So because of this inflationary gap, so we may want the economy go slow to avoid bigger problem down the road, right? So that's how we can do that. So we have contractionary fiscal policy. This includes a reduction in government purchase of goods and service. Think about the government cut down the spending, like either in national defense or in infrastructure investment. Or maybe there's an increase in tax. Think about this increase in consumption tax, or maybe there's an increase in income tax. Or maybe there's a reduction in government transfer, right? Okay, so to summarize, this contractionary fiscal policy is like press the brakes for the economy. And we want the economy to go slow, okay? To avoid overheat in the economy. Right, so you can see, so if we do this contractionary fiscal policy, you can see we can restore to this long-run equilibrium, right? But yes, we can leave the economy alone, and then the economy is going to adjust through aggregate supply, right? So if we are in an inflationary gap, and then so eventually the aggregate supply will go down. And the reason why the aggregate supply will move to the left-hand side is because this inflationary gap will eventually lead the wage rate to increase, right? Because right now the unemployment rate is so low, and eventually it becomes difficult for business to hire worker, and then so the wage rate must increase. So that is going to put a downward pressure on aggregate supply. So that's what is going to happen without government intervention. But you can see, so if we leave the economy alone, we are going to see a higher and higher inflation down the road. So that's going to cause more damage to the economy. So that is why we may want the economy to go slow, and that's why so we may use contractionary fiscal policy. Now let's look at another practice questions. Do you think the government is right to begin massive spending program during deep recession? So the recession typically is caused by, as we said, typically is caused by negative demand shock, right? Now with this negative demand shock, and then so we have reason to believe, yes, we should let the government to help the economy by carry out expansionary fiscal policy, right? So the answer is yes. Okay? Now we look at another practice question. Okay. Suppose a country wishes to produce at its potential output level, holding everything else constant, identify which of the following policy initiatives might help it reach its goal, and how these policy initiatives would help. A, the government initiates policies that encourage private investment spending. So that is considered as expansionary fiscal policy, right? So that's going to help aggregate demand. And the B, the government increase the amount of money it borrows in the loanable fund market to increase the level of government spending in the economy. Okay, so this also is going to help. So this also is going to help the economy, right? Because that's going to increase government spending. And the C, the government increase tax on consumer and corporations. So that is considered as a contraction of fiscal policy. So that won't increase spending. Instead, that's going to depress the economy further. And the D, the government authorized new spending program. Yes, so this is an expansionary fiscal policy. Right. Okay. So the discussion or the answer to the previous question is listed in this slide. So if you have any questions, you can read this more carefully. Okay. So now we move on to see some criticisms regarding to the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And this is particularly about expansionary fiscal policy. And so typically, so there are three critiques regarding to the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policy. First, people may argue government spending will crowd out private spending. So this just says if G increase, so you are going to decrease C. So they may cancel each other. That is going to reduce the net effect of expansionary fiscal policy. Secondly, people may argue government borrowing crowd out private investment spending. Or in other words, if government increase spending by borrow, and then so that's going to depress I. Okay, so again, so that may offset the impact of expansionary fiscal policy. And third critique says government budget deficit reduce private spending. So this just says if a government reduce tax, okay, and so you are going to reduce consumer spending. Okay, so yes, earlier we say okay, tax reduction will increase C, but they say there are other forms you forgot. So that may reduce private spending. So those are the critics argue against expansionary fiscal policy. In the following slides, so we need to examine them one by one. Okay? Let's start with claim number one. Government spending always crowd out private spending. Okay? So this statement is problematic, or you can say it's wrong, because this statement assumes a zero-sum game. So what is a zero-sum game? Meaning, so if you have a winner, and then so you must have a loser. Right? If you win, meaning so if the government wins, and then so it must at the cost of the household consumption. So that's their argument. But this argument is true if we have a fixed sum of aggregate income. Okay, but this is not a reasonable assumption when economy is in a recession. Okay, so when the economy is in recession, so largely means so the economy not fully employed. Okay, so we have potential to improve. Okay, so we have potential to create a win-win situation. Okay, so this background picture kind of tell us the story, right? So if this jacuzzi is pretty much filled or very crowded, and then so if you have one additional person jumps in, so this person's gain will come at the cost of other person who are already inside the jacuzzi. Right? So because you're going to squeeze people who are already inside. So in that sense, so this is zero-sum game. And in that sense, so you're going to cause somebody else. Right? But if we are in a recession, and then use this jacuzzi to understand the situation of the economy. So that just means so the jacuzzi is pretty empty. Okay? If that's the case, you have another person jumps in, it won't cause the other person who are already inside this jacuzzi. Or in other words, this is not a zero-sum game. Right? So actually, so the other person jumps in, so we'll make everybody better off. So in the sense, maybe you have other person talk to each other, to like a chatting, to have some conversation, right? Okay, so this is claim number one. Now we can look at claim number two. Government borrowing always crowd out private investment spending, right? So this just says, so there are a fixed amount of money. So if the government borrow to pay for their spending, and then there's less money left in the financial market, so that the private sector, think of households or business, they can borrow from, right? But the reality is, so if we are in a recession, so the economy is not fully employed. So if the government borrows, and then so we lift off the economy, and then so we can generate more savings. Okay, so this more saving will allow the government and the private sector to borrow at the same time and the same rate. As a matter of fact, so in 2009, so when the government borrowed and to stimulate the economy, the interest rate actually went down instead of went up. Okay? So if the interest rate went down, meaning so we have plenty of money that give us that allows us to borrow. Right? So that is for claim number two. Now let's go to the last claim. The last claim says government budget deficit reduce private saving. So the argument goes as follows. So the government reduced tax today. And then, yes, presumably, so my income is going to increase today. and then my consumption will increase today. But however, so this argument says, okay, so wait a second. So if you cut tax today, you're going to have, let's go here. So as the government, you're going to have deficit. How are you going to pay for your deficit? You must borrow. And then, so if you borrow and eventually you must pay off your debt, right? So, but how are you going to pay off your debt in the future? So it means you must raise tax in the future or in good time. So if you raise tax in the future, and that means that what that means to me, is so my income, my present value of income won't change much. Yes, I have temporary increase income today, but in the future, my income will decrease. Okay, for the households, I will consider a temporary change in income and eventually change in income. So I need to consider both impact. So these may cancel each other, so leads to my consumption decline. Right, so this is claim number 3. And this claim number 3 actually has a fancy name, it's called Ricardian equivalence. Okay, so remember we talked about this famous economist, David Ricardo, and he discovered this comparative advantage. Right now, in this slide, he discovered another important thing in macroeconomics, which is Ricardian equivalence. So this Ricardian equivalence essentially says whether the government finance the spending with tax or with borrowing. So the net impact on my income is going to be the same. Tax is not a free lunch tax cut is not a free lunch to me. Okay, so in that sense, a tax cut won't have real impact on the economy. But however, in reality, it's a little bit more complicated. Just think about if the government postpone the tax increase in the future until the current generation already passed away. So for example, the government can issue a 50 years bond or maybe 100 years bond, right? And they use this 100 years bond to finance tax cut today. So if that's the case, it won't have much impact on your current, it will have real impact on your consumption, right? Okay, so as usual, let's just take a 5 minutes break and we continue our discussion.